Okay, today we'll be looking at climate change and the three tragedies. And the three tragedies are the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of the horizon, and the tragedy of the transition. So the content will actually begin with an introduction, then we'll go into the tragedy of the commons and see Garrett Hardin's view on the tragedy of the commons. After which we'll proceed to tragedy of the horizon, which was anchored by the ideas of Mark Carney. They will look at tragedy of the transition. They will look at the interaction between the three tragedies, then the role of banks and financial institutions as major agents of change in terms of climate change. They will look at the policy and strategic responses, then the key takeaways, and we'll end with a conclusion. Climate change is actually a collective action problem. So there's actually sort of a collective need for us to actually tackle the ideas of climate change. And the three critical frameworks are actually sort of tragedies, which are actually the tragedy of the commons, the horizon, and of the transition. Tragedy of the Commons. What is the tragedy of the commons? This concept was actually anchored by Garrett Hardin. Before then, there was William Foster, which actually brought the ideas of the tragedy of the commons. But the analogy behind the tragedy of the commons is if there's a public good, then there is incentive for people to actually sort of use the public good maximally without taking into cognizance the other users of the public good. So how do we manage this tragedy to make sure everybody gets an equitable value of the public good? So there's a free rider effect, and the atmosphere is actually sort of a public good in this time and age. So how do we actually reduce the impact of people taking advantage of the atmosphere as a public good, especially the developed countries? So that is where the tragedy of the commons come into play. So the example is the atmosphere as a public good. The emission of CO2 is quite skewed, whereby the advanced countries actually emit more CO2s than the less developed countries. So this is actually a common problem because the emission of greenhouse gases affects the world as a global unit. So how do we tackle this tragedy of the commons as it pertains to the climate? The common problem is the individual benefit. So the developed countries have actually developed because of the exploitation of the climate and the emission of greenhouse gases. So there's actually sort of economic growth due to the burning of fossil fuel, which puts them at a higher pedestal. What is the collective cost? The collective cost is what we see, which is called the chronic problem or the chronic risk, physical risk of climate change, which is the rising temperature and the change in precipitation level. What is the incentive to free ride? The incentive is if people exploit the climate, there is no cost, immediate cost on any individual. So it needs to be a collective action or an ethical action for us to actually tackle the impact of greenhouse gases on the planet. So what's the results? The result of the tragedy of the commons in terms of climate impact is the over-emission. The over-emission of greenhouse gases by the developed countries due to exploitation of fossil fuel and other greenhouse emitting ventures. And there's also underinvestment in mitigation controls. They don't have investment in trying to reduce the mitigation controls as the less developed countries do not have enough capital and are quite dependent on agriculture and are exposed to climate change impact due to the geographical location of the countries. What are the policy implications? Because climate change as a common problem needs to actually be probably imbibed into policies. So we need to actually do some policy implications. So we need collective governance. So collective governance involves international cooperation in terms of tackling the climate change, whereby the developed countries needs to provide the adequate funds for the less developed countries to actually tackle climate change. There needs to be international agreements. The international agreements such as like the United Nations framework Convention on Climate Change is quite key, and their formation of the COP, which is the Conference of the Parties, is quite key in tackling climate change. And the Paris Agreement was quite instrumental because they actually raised the ideas of providing funds in terms of tackling climate change impact. Carbon pricing and regulation. Carbon pricing, such as like the cap and trade policies, might be instrumental in terms of measuring and actually sort of trading emission, and probably carbon taxes will be sort of crucial as policy implications in tackling climate change. What are the challenges for these policies? The challenges are the enforcement. How do they enforce these laws? Things like the nationally determined contributions, are they enforceable? And is there a global coordination in terms of meeting the world need or meeting the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions? What is the tragedy of the horizon? Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor and right now the Prime Minister of Canada, was quite instrumental in shaping the ideas of climate change, and he coined a word which is tragedy of the horizon. What is tragedy of the horizon? The political implication or the political need or the political structure or the financial structure is sort of immediate, is sort of short-termist in terms of their views, whereby climate change impact is sort of long term. So how do we measure this time horizon in terms of tackling the impacts of climate change? Is a dire needs. It's actually a dire need, and there's actually sort of a mismatch of time horizons. So that is the idea of the tragedy of the horizons. We need to act as fast because inaction will actually have a great impact on the future generation. What are the mechanisms based on the horizon problem, which is a time difference? We actually have the financial markets. The short-term returns dominate decision making. So we're actually sort of short-termists in terms of our financial decisions. We need to be forward-looking. We need to look at the impact of our financial decisions on the future generation. What are the political cycles? Our political cycles are sort of short term too, probably in terms of the political changes. So we need to actually have a long term political views in terms of tackling this climate change. Then firm behavior. Firms discount hyperbolically. So they need to actually look into the future, into the impact of their decisions on the future generation in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. So what's the outcome? The outcome is there's delayed climate action. We are looking at, because of the risk and uncertainty involved in climate change, we don't see the urgency of our decisions. There's underpricing of climate risk. We underprice climate risk. Climate risk are not embedded in financial instruments, in political decisions. So we need to actually embed the ideas of climate risk in our political and financial decisions. So what's the implication for finance? The implications for finance is quite enormous. That means if we don't embed climate risk into our political and financial decisions, it will lead to mispricing of financial assets, which are exposed to both the physical and transition risk of climate impact. Also, stranded assets. There's a risk for stranded assets, such as fossil fuels, because fossil fuels might not be sort of renewable, and the economy is sort of changing into a net zero economy. So, a lot of assets might become stranded. Also, there's need for disclosure because we need to actually disclose the impact of our businesses or ventures on the environment and the impact of the environment on our ventures and operations. This is actually like a double materiality impact. So we need to start disclosing. So things like the task force on climate related financial disclosures is quite a key framework. And also the ESROS, which is the European Sustainability Reporting Standard, is quite key in terms for our need for climate disclosures, both identifying the risk, assessing the risk, managing the risk, and disclosing the impact of climate risk on our strategy, on our financial performance, and also the metrics and measurement of these greenhouse gas emissions. So what is the tragedy of the transition? For us to move to a net zero economy, it comes at a cost. So it could lead to disruption So this tragedy is sort of why people are sort of afraid of moving to a net zero economy. What's the impact it might have for jobs? What's the impact it might have for the economy? The abrupt disruption. So there needs to be a plan for an orderly manner to transition into a net zero economy. What are the mechanisms or the transition problem? Policy changes, carbon taxes and regulatory measures. So policy changes like carbon taxes and cap and trade policies might actually be a sort of a limiting problem in terms of the transition into a net zero economy. Also, technological shifts. The movement into renewable sources of energy or a net zero economy might have an impact on the economy. Things like moving to electric vehicles might creatively destroy some other forms of a market or some other forms of industry. So the transitioning problem is sort of a tragedy. So also market re-evaluation, sudden reassessment of assets value. So assets will need to be revalued because of the transitioning into a net zero or a renewable economy, such as the fossil fuel industries. What is the risk or what are the risks involved in the transitioning to a net zero economy? Financial instability, because of climate risk is sort of systemic and it affects the financial industry. It could lead to stress in the financial market because of their heavy investment in carbon intensive industries. Also, sectoral job losses. A lot of losses can be lost, jobs can be lost in terms of in the carbon intensive industry. So, this could actually create a transition problem. Also, things like sudden assets devaluation. A lot of assets, like the fossil fuel assets, might be devalued due to transitioning into renewable sources of energy, which might have a major systemic impact on the financial markets. What are the interaction between these three tragedies? It actually has a combined effect. The tragedy of the common has a major effect of the overuse of the atmosphere. Since nobody is responsible, everybody probably acts in their own self-interest or selfish interest, which might aid or increase the overuse of the atmosphere, such as emission of greenhouse gases from large corporations. So this could be an anchor, a major impact of the tragedy of the commons. Also, the tragedy of the horizon, there is delayed action because of the mismatch of the time horizon between our financial and political decision against the uncertainty of the climate impact. Then what is the transition problem or the effect of the transition tragedy? Is the risk of abrupt correction. How do we correct the impact? How do we correct the future movement into a renewable source of economy or a net zero economy? So both three tragedies actually have a combined effect which creates systemic climate risk, which might amplify both economic and financial vulnerabilities. So we need to act as fast in terms of dealing with the climate change, looking at the common problem, also the transition, and also the tragedy of the horizons. What are the role of banks and financial institutions? Banks and financial institutions play a key role. From the Paris Agreement, it was instituted that they need to actually finance both adaptation and mitigation control. So they play a key role as they fund industries, as they fund a couple of ventures. So their role in capital allocation is quite key. They need to direct investment across carbon friendly sectors. They need to influence the transition. They need to actually invest more in the renewable or the green energy. Then they need to take into cognizance climate risk and its impact on financial assets or financial decisions. What are the tools and mechanisms they can use? They can use things like financial disclosures, which are quite key in delivering signaling the effects of climate risk to the users of financial information. They need to actually embed stress testing into their scenarios in order to actually see how these financial institutions are resilient to climate impact. Also, sustainable finance initiatives. They need to mobilize capital for green investment. Quite a key factor because green investment needs to drive the economy to the next level and look for the future generation based on sustainability. So, what are the policies and strategic responses? Key measures: we should gradually and orderly transition policies. So policies should be orderly, embedded, so there will be a clean transition into a net zero economy. There should be long-term risk integration. We need to look at the future impact of our financial and political decisions on the future generation. So sustainability should be the watchword. There should be global cooperation framework. So there should be cooperation frameworks, whether regional or global. It could be South Asian, it could be West African, it could be Sub-Saharan African, but there needs to be global cooperation in terms of tackling climate change. Then there needs to be incentives for green investment. There should be incentives, maybe cheaper loan interest on green projects so that they can foster change and move and mitigate and reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions. What are the key takeaways? Climate change is a multi-layered economic failure or externality or negative externality. So it requires coordination across governments, financial institutions, and corporations. So there needs to be a connection or a working together, a coordination between countries, financial institutions, nations, regional integration in terms of tackling climate change. The urgency lies in balancing timely action with stable transition. So we need to look at our actions, both politically, financially, and embed it into the transition process, and also look at the effect of this common problem as pertains emission by the advanced countries. So what's the conclusion? Addressing climate change requires solving three interconnected problems. These are collective action failure, which is the tragedy of the commons because of the emission of greenhouse gases, which is sort of skewed and more skewed towards the advanced countries as opposed to the less developed countries, even from the past and at the present. There's always a time inconsistency issue because of our political and financial decisions and the impact or the uncertainty or risk of climate change impact for the future generation. So we need to look at sustainability. Then the adjustment risk. How do we adjust into a net zero economy? It comes with its own cost. Also, with the cost comes with its opportunities. So we should look at the opportunities of transitioning into a net zero economy. So effective climate policy must be coordinated, forward looking, and carefully managed to avoid systemic disruption.